In our lesson today, we're going to be taking a look at a passage in the book of Hebrews. And in this passage that we're going to be looking at, the Hebrew writer is going to be encouraging his readers to remain faithful to the Lord so that they can receive the rest that the Lord had promised to them. He would remind them of the example of their forefathers as we read about them in the Old Testament, of the Israelites and what happened to them. And he's going to remind them that they did not remain faithful to the Lord. And so he warned them that just as they did, their forefathers did, they could fall short of the promised rest that the Lord was promising to them. Now, these instructions, as we look at them, apply to us just as much today as they did to the ones that they were originally written to, because we could fall short of the promised reward that the Lord is offering to us if we follow the example of those who fell before. So we're going to look at this passage here and see what lessons we can learn from it. He begins by talking about the danger of falling away from the Lord, falling away from the faith. In Hebrews chapter 3, beginning in verse 12, he said, "Take care, brethren, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. But encourage one another, day after day, as long as it is still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. While it is said, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart as when they provoked me." So he's encouraging them to remain faithful, encourage one another to be faithful. Do not harden your heart as others did. He goes on and continues here. He says, "For who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt, led by Moses? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? But to those who were disobedient. So we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief." So this is the warning. This is the example that he brings up. It wasn't a positive example. Say, well, look at what your forefathers did. You need to do what they did. No, he's telling them, do not do what they did. He's citing their bad example, this negative example, saying don't follow in their footsteps. There's a popular belief in the religious world today that's sometimes referred to as once saved, always saved. Sometimes it's called the perseverance of the saints or the impossibility of apostasy, or different ways that it might be labeled. But it's the idea that once someone is a Christian and is saved by God, now some people will say, well, the people who fall away, they weren't real Christians. But the idea is there that once you are saved, you cannot be lost. You will always be saved no matter what you do. That doctrine is not what the New Testament teaches. It is contrary to this passage that we read here. As the Hebrew writer said at the beginning of that passage, he warns them not to develop an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. And he wasn't writing to people who were supposedly Christians but weren't really Christians. He was writing to ones that he called in verse 1 of that chapter, holy brethren. So these were ones who were Christians. They were saved by God, but they could fall away. So this idea, and there are other passages that also talk about this as well. We don't have time to get into those, but the idea that once we are saved, we're always saved, that we cannot be lost, we cannot fall away. It's not what the New Testament teaches. And I think a lot of us understand that. We understand that, yes, a Christian can fall away. Yes, a Christian can be lost. But even if we don't believe that, are we guilty of living as if we do believe that we really can't be lost? We need to be careful, not fall as they did. The Hebrew writer said that we have a responsibility to encourage one another. Encourage one another. This is why he would say later in this letter He emphasized the assembly, that you are not to forsake our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encourage one another. As he talked about that in chapter 10. But here in chapter 3, in this text that we're reading from, this is about more than just the assembly. He says you do this day after day, as long as it is still called today, emphasizing the importance and the necessity of this. This is not something to put off, not something to think that, well, this isn't really all that important, or, well, just as long as we do this once a week on Sunday, then when we meet together, that's really all there is. We're not forsaking the assembly. Well, good, don't forsake the assembly. But keep in mind that this encouragement is something that we need to do day after day, as long as it is still called today. We all need this encouragement, because there's the danger for any one of us to develop an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. He reminded them of the failings of their forefathers, of the Israelites, as we read about them in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Exodus, as they were led out of Egypt. He described them in this passage that they hardened their hearts, they provoked God, they sinned against Him, they were disobedient to Him. And so what did God do as a result? Well, it says that God was angry with them for 40 years. Their bodies fell in the wilderness, and they missed out on the rest that was promised to them. What's interesting there, as we read there in the last verse that we read so far, in verse 19, it says, this demonstrated their unbelief. Notice again in Hebrews 3 and verse 19. So we see that they were not able to enter the promised rest. They were not able to enter because of unbelief. They sinned. They were disobedient. They provoked God. They did all of those things. But the root cause of all of this was unbelief. Now, we might wonder, how could they not believe God? God was the one who led them out of Egypt. God was the one who parted the Red Sea and allowed them to cross. And then they, after they got through, saw the Egyptian army destroyed as the waters came back over them. God provided for them. God led them. How could they have this unbelief? Well, they may have believed in God, recognized that who He was, recognized His existence. They believed in God, but they didn't believe God. They didn't trust His promises. They didn't trust that He would do what He said He would do. They believed in God. They saw all of these signs, but they didn't believe God. That's a danger we can get ourselves into. We might believe in the existence of God, but if we don't believe God, believe His word, trust His promises, and demonstrate that through obedience to Him, we are going to be in the same condition as those who fell in the wilderness. So this passage begins by talking about this danger of falling away, that we could fall short of that promise. And so the Hebrew writer then goes on, continues right into the next chapter. It's all the same context. He tells them they need to fear. In chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, he says, therefore let us fear, if while a promise remains of entering His rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. For indeed we have had good news preached to us, just as they also. But the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard. For we who have believed enter that rest, just as He has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although His works were finished from the foundation of the world. And he continues, he says, for He has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all His works. And again in this passage, they shall not enter my rest. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, He again fixes a certain day, today, saying through David after so long a time, just as He had said before, today if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts. So as he continues this, he talks about the real possibility that we could fall short just as they did. So he says, let us fear. Why does he say, let us fear? Because if we fall short, there's another fate that awaits us. He described this later in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 26 through 31. Notice what he says here. And this applies for us as Christians. This is the warning for us today. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 26 through 31. For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses, which is what the Israelites did, anyone who set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much severer punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God, has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and has insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay, and again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. That is the fate that awaits us if we are not faithful, if we fall away, if we fall short of reaching this reward. The Hebrew writer says, this is what awaits us. We see the punishment under the old law, under the Old Testament system for God's people when they were disobedient. But how much severer punishment do we deserve when we reject Christ and his offer of salvation, and we disregard the hope and the promises that he provides to us? It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And the Hebrew writer described the fact that we have some of the same benefits that the Israelites had. He said that they had good news preached to them. Well, we have good news that is preached to us as well. Over in Romans chapter 1, Paul described this good news that we have preached to us in verses 16 and 17. He said, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. Just as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. We have the good news that is preached to us, but we have to live by faith. It has to be united in faith, as he said there in those verses. The good news preached to them, as it says there in verse 2 of Hebrews 4, it did not profit them because it was not united by faith in those who heard. The Hebrew writer also mentioned the fact that God finished his work with them. In verse 3 of Hebrews 4, God has finished his work in the sense of delivering and making salvation available to us. Titus 2:11 says, the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men. God has made salvation possible for us. He's done his work, but we need to respond with our work, our responsibility of what he has called us to do. We will fail to enter that rest if we follow the example of disobedience. Again, Hebrews 4 and verse 6, therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience. That's a warning for us. We could fail to enter the promised rest that awaits us through disobedience. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said in Matthew 7:13 and 14 that there are 2 paths that we could take. One is the broad way that leads to destruction, and the other is the narrow way that leads to life. And he says there are only few who find that way. Only a few will enter, and it will be those who do the will of the Father, do the will of God. Jesus explained that just a few verses later in Matthew 7, verses 21 through 23. Those who do the will of my Father will enter the kingdom. Not those who just claim to do the will of the Father, as he said in verses 22 and 23, but were guilty of practicing lawlessness. Not them. They were actually disobedient, regardless of what their claim was. He says those who do the will of the Father, they will be able to enter through obedience. But if we disobey, then we will miss out on this. And the Hebrew writer says that the day for us to resolve to do this is today. Again, notice how he quotes this is today if you hear his voice. Today is the day to do this. And so he says that he's fixed a day. God has appointed a day for us to make the decision that we are going to follow him. We are going to obey him. And that day is today. And again, remember what we read in the first part of this passage in chapter 3 and verse 14, where he says that if we have become partakers of Christ, for we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. For it is said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Hold fast to that assurance of hope, starting today. Don't put it off. Don't think that, well, we can do this later. Don't think that, well, I can obey God later. The day to do it is today. And we need to remember, we can fall short. So he said, let us fear. Don't think this is something that we can just put off and it doesn't matter. And then as we finish up this section of verses here, he encouraged them to be diligent, which is encouragement for us as well. In Hebrews 4, verses 8 through 11, he says, if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience. We need to understand the rest that he's talking about here, the rest that awaits us. It's not the temporary rest that was given by Joshua as they conquered the land of Canaan and they had rest there. That's not the rest he's talking about. The Hebrew writer says that if that was it, that he wouldn't have spoken of another day. The rest that we are hoping for and striving for is the eternal rest that is given by Christ. There remains this rest for the people of God. That's what our hope is. That's what we're striving for. And Jesus has gone, as the Hebrew writer said it later in chapter 10 and verse 12, he's sat down at the right hand of God. He, to use the language of verse 3, he completed his work. Now we need to complete our work. We need to do what we are responsible to do. Let us then be diligent. There is effort that is required on our part. We are not completely passive in this. We cannot be saved without the Lord, but we do have a responsibility. The Hebrew writer said in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 9, that having been made perfect, he, Jesus, became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation. Who is it that the Lord is going to save? It's those who obey him. We need to be diligent in obeying the Lord. And again, remember the example there of the Israelites. Do not follow, as he says there in verse 11, the same example of disobedience that we see in them. Don't follow their example. They were God's chosen people. He led them out of the land of Egypt. He delivered them from bondage, but they rebelled against him. They did not enter into the rest that was promised. Well, we are God's chosen people today. Peter talked about that in 1 Peter 2 and verse 9. We are a chosen race, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. We are his people. We are Christians. We are in the church. We are the people of God today. But just as the ones he led out of Egypt fell away from him and missed out on the reward, same thing can happen to us. We need to guard against that. So as we think about everything that we see here in this passage as we've studied here today, God has promised and prepared for us a rest with him in heaven. So we need to be diligent in serving him, continue to faithfully obey him so that we can receive it. And as we do that, we need to be encouraging others as well so that they can enjoy that with us. We can all enjoy this rest together. This is a hope for all of us. If we will follow him, we need to encourage one another to do that and to continue on working toward that goal. But as we do that, remember this example. Remember the example of the Israelites so that we do not fall as they did. Let us not just believe God or just believe in God while living as if we really don't believe God. Believe in him that he exists, but not really believe him and his promises and what he has said and what he has instructed us to do. It's not enough just to believe in God. We need to believe God and follow him because we can fall short. That was the warning. But we won't fall short if we will faithfully, diligently, and persistently serve him. So let's not give up. Let's keep pressing on toward that goal that the Hebrew writer talked about, that we could enter into that rest. We can be with the Lord for eternity. That's open for all of us. But we have to be faithful. We have to continue serving him and not fall away. So let's not follow the example of the Israelites who fell in the wilderness. Instead, let's continue to serve the Lord, no matter how much time we have here. Continue to serve him and always be faithful to him.